Everyone, welcome to another installment of live data chats with David and Kevin. And today we're going to be talking about a perennial topic that is not exclusive to data observability, but is applicable to data observability, which is if you're convinced that you have a problem and you want to bring on data observability, what do you do? Do you buy a tool? Do you build it yourself, or do you implement an open source tool? So to start us off, David, what are the considerations as a data leader between building, buying, and using an open source data observability tool?
Yeah, and I think with this topic, it's very similar to many other tools that you might choose. There's always this choice between building it yourself, buying the tooling, or going with open source and hosting it yourself. So I think there are some common concerns which are true for all tools, but there's like one or two that's kind of specialized to an observability tool. And I think the key themes that I think that are important are quality of the tool, um, alert fatigue, and that's quite specialized to an observability tool or monitoring tool of any kind. Security, which is common to all tools, customization, infrastructure, and cost. So I think those are like the key things I would think about in this decision-making process.
Which make a lot of sense. When you listed out that list, I found myself nodding along. And uh, do you think that there's like a one size fits all about like the ranking of that list? Because of course it depends on the company and the context. Like if you had a blanket recommendation for which characteristics to think about, what would you recommend?
It's very tough to give a blanket recommendation. There's so much about the context. Like there's so much about what kind of company this is. So, fundamentally, if this was a big tech company that, think big enough to be a cloud provider as well, you know, there would be a big push towards build because they would believe they could build as well as anyone else. But, that's a handful of companies in the world. And actually, for many others, build is potentially the wrong move. Yeah, it's very tough. It's very tough to give a blanket. It's really context dependent. I think when we go through those dimensions for each one, you'll make it kind of clear like where they win and where they lose.
For sure. Right. Yeah. Every company is different. You called out like the FANG, the mega tech companies with,
Yeah,
uh, data platform teams that are larger than some companies.
yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So yeah, it's so hard to make a blanket recommendation. And I think probably throughout the next 30 minutes, there's going to be a lot of it depends.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So I think should we go on to what should you consider when you choose to build? I think, yeah.
The the main thing that comes to mind is time. And take it from people who are building a data observability tool, it's not a walk in the park uh, because it takes a lot of time from your team to build the first version from scratch. Might take a few months, but also it takes time on an ongoing basis. And this is what's typically underestimated by teams building their own data tools, because not only are you trying to refine the models, trying to keep everything up to date with your data, but naturally you're going to get feature requests. Suddenly you're turning into a product team. And uh, one thing I've noticed is that the first 80% is easy, especially if you take advantage of the tools that you already have, right? Like instead of building a UI and requiring front end development skills, can you use your existing BI dashboard to build it? The first 80% is easy. The last 20% is very, very tough. And this is where a lot of teams that we talk to say, okay, like we built our own custom data observability tooling, but it's becoming a lot, right? And it's fascinating that teams are more receptive to these vendor conversations after they built the tool and not before they build the tool. It's not what you'd expect,
They're some
right?
of our best customers, aren't they? Customers who tried to build this and decided it was too hard.
It, it really is because they see the full picture of like what the alternatives are.
Yeah.
And of course, like when we're talking about time, like, right, time is money. 1 or 2 months of a full-time hire is it can be substantial, especially when the expertise is not necessarily there to build a robust software tool. And this is not a knock on like data practitioners, but software development is a distinct skill set, right? It requires, often, I mean, a whole bunch of different considerations, often different language and a way of thinking about things. But to be to be fair, there's benefits to building it yourself, right? If there weren't benefits, teams wouldn't be doing it. But
Yeah.
you mentioned customization. I think this is maybe the strongest benefit where open source and commercial tools have an incentive to support the most common integrations.
Yes.
Snowflake, Looker, right? It's all a question of addressable market. But companies frequently will have unique, highly bespoke data sources. Uh, Sometimes they're built in house, sometimes they're open source or uh,
A bit obscure. There's so
a bit
many.
obscure. Exactly, and good luck getting a commercial tool to support that unless you're writing a huge check. And if you have the context, if that bespoke source is so important, maybe you need to build it yourself in order to support it.
Yeah.
Or if your team has a very unique workflow, I think that's less common. But
Yeah.
uh,
The other reason I think that sometimes it's a good idea, well, it's the only idea is to build is for security. Some infosec requirements, like for example, some infosec requirements require software to be run on-prem, and you're going to struggle to find like well, SaaS companies don't do that, right? That's typically not what they do. They run it for you elsewhere. And so that building it yourself guarantees that you know what the software will do and that you can run it exactly where you want and how you want. Network isolation, whatever you need to do to meet your requirements, you can do if you build it yourself. And that's one thing that I think like a open source or bought option won't give you.
even if they're like SOC 2 and HIPAA and you list all the acronyms, even if they're compliant, InfoSec teams often have a principle of minimizing exfiltration, right? Which makes sense. The other side of the coin is that if you're building a tool or using an open source tool to monitor data that's in the cloud anyways, right? To monitor Snowflake, which is almost all the time in the cloud and almost all the time in AWS,
Yeah.
right? Like the data is already exfiltrated in a sense,
Yeah.
but of course they're extremely secure.
Yeah.
Uh, but that is a nice segue to open source, right? Um, like for you, and you're very familiar with the space. Like, what should you consider when you implement an open source data observability solution?
I think it goes back to those dimensions, right? It's whereas with building it yourself, unless you're one of those giant companies that can spin up a team to build it bigger than say bigger than Metaplane, and some of them can do that, right? Often you can't do that. So then with open source, you can get a higher quality tool than if you built it yourself because it's being used by many teams, many people are contributing to it, can have many features that would take you a while to build. Having said that, one of the difficult things about a system which includes machine learning like an observability tool typically does to be high quality, um, that actually reduces the level of quality that's often possible to be offered in an open source tool. Um, some of the things that you can do when you provide this as a service is just superior in terms of adaptation to what customers do and how they respond and how they want to feed back into the models. Like that's usually not possible in open source. I'm not going to say never. There may well be a case one day where someone builds something that sophisticated and it's open source. Um, I also think often the open source offerings have uh, they're open source to a point, and then once you want the best features that would give it parity with a bought offering, you end up with a bought offering, right? And that's like the cloud version. And you can see many of the open source like data quality vendors today do it having this exact strategy. And that's what happens when you're VC backed and you're an open source offering. The point is it's a marketing strategy really. And I think alert fatigue is a real problem with open source because with that possible lower quality of tooling, alert fatigue is a real problem in observability tools if it's not really high quality and well managed. And I think that's one problem with open source is that what some of those nice ML features like feeding back into the model, teaching it what's normal and what's not, and them not being possible necessarily in open source, but are possible in a bought system. That could be a problem with having higher alert fatigue from open source and then the tooling being less useful and potentially switched off or ignored. And that's a real problem because that's one of the Achilles heel of observability tools if that's not well managed in the tool. Actually, one thing I find really interesting is security because some people think security is higher for open source because you can really run it where you want to run it. But one thing that InfoSec teams often say is they don't like it. They think it's the worst of both of all worlds because they've got no one to blame and sue if there's some kind of problem. And at the same time, it's not their own software, so that they know exactly how it works. So you will see some InfoSec teams not liking open source. They'd rather build or buy. But yeah.
That's
Then cut.
fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. It's quite an interesting perspective. I think when I heard that for the first time. Customization. So I think this is where open source is a bit better than bought because of course you can make a PR, and they may accept it, but they may not. So it's kind of like a halfway house between building it yourself and buying, and it's kind of natural that because many teams are using it, that you can't just do exactly what you want to it, but you can do some things if it's kind of in line with the way the tool was built. At the same time, there's engineering costs to that, right? So you have to be able to, write code and submit a PR in that, in whatever stack that tool is built in. And let's say you may not have that. Also, if your team is made of data engineers, like they may not be the best at contributing to an open source piece of software unless they have that software engineering background or skill set as well. And then infrastructure, right? Infrastructure becomes a problem. And in some ways, I think this is where open source is the worst of the three, is you have to host that in that open source system. And it may have been built in kind of a strange way with kind of over complex architecture, like having like two different databases and like quite a few components that if you built it yourself, you wouldn't have needed all of them because it has the features that you just need. And then if you had a bought offering, the bought offering would you wouldn't have to worry about infrastructure. That's not your problem with SaaS especially. So that's one thing. Is like data teams. Some data teams have like data platform engineers, and they're pretty good at some of that SRE and DevOps skill set, and then they can handle running open source themselves. But that again comes with a cost, of using that resource in that way. There's opportunity costs, right? If is running open source tooling and maintaining it and looking after it, and is that something you want to spend your engineering time on, or would you rather you spend your engineering time on your main goals as a company, right? There's opportunity costs there. So I think that's probably how I would kind of cover looking at open source. It's certainly it's certainly a decent choice at times, but you really need to think about those costs and those compromises that you'll have. And often as well, like we offer this is sometimes small teams feel like they have to go open source because that's what they can afford because it's free or just uses extra time of theirs to look after. But actually, many SaaS providers have like a free tier, like we do, where if you're really that small, the free tier might be good enough for you until it's a big enough problem that actually you may be willing to pay for it, or you may have budget that's come along.
Right, right. And I think you laid it out perfectly. Maybe on the whole, open source is, the costs are also the risks, right? Where, I mean, the benefits are also the costs, I should say, where like it's more customizable, but it really depends on the architecture and the abstractions in the library. Like you are able to fork it and like sync in with main, but that also takes time. So and I would say that it's highly dependent on the maturity of the ecosystem, right? Like if you're considering of bringing on GitLab for version control, or you're using Terraform, these are massive public companies backing this, as opposed to open source offerings that are a labor of love, that are spun out from a team from a larger company, that are supported by a startup. It's it's hard to uh, say one blanket statement about all of open source, but I think the categories you outlined definitely resonate.
Yeah. And I feel like you see in like orchestration and transformation, like you've got DBT and then Airflow, Dagster, Prefect as like really fantastic open source tooling that, to be honest, I don't know of paid tooling that's better. I don't think it exists. And I think in those kind of instances, open source is a great choice, but you may choose like a hosted version or to look after it yourself but you have a stronger choice. And I think currently in data observability and actually any tooling which has machine learning involved, typically we're seeing that open source isn't the most strong or the most chosen option.
Perhaps better than building it in-house still.
Yeah, but potentially, yeah, definitely.
That was a great breakdown. And the immediate question then is, what about the third bucket, right? Like, what should
Yeah,
you consider when you buy a tool?
yeah. And I think quality is like one of the main considerations here is that, you know, you've got many vendors who've been given lots of funding to go and build a high quality tool that meets, the largest surface area of customer needs possible with that funding. And for most companies, they just can't, they can't afford to have a full-time engineering team building a data observability tool. Whereas these companies like Metaplane can afford to do that's our purpose, right? To build this tool as well as we can with full-time engineering and product thought and actually just thinking, how can we build this to the very best of our ability? And it being our full-time job, it's not something we're doing as well as whatever else we need to do. This is the job, right? And I think that's really key is that quality. And it becomes affordable because you're effectively sharing the cost of that quality with many other companies, tens, hundreds of customers that some of these tools can have. And I think with that quality, then you get that likelihood of reduced alert fatigue. Like really, if you're buying a tool, your alert fatigue should be lower than if you had built it yourself or it was open source in all likelihood. Because these tools can be sophisticated, like having feedback back into the machine learning models that can help those models learn what's normal and what's not, and uh, have automated incident management, for example, which isn't always, which you may have built if you built it yourself, but that's again difficult to build and you maintain, and it's unlikely to be an open source.
Those are the
Security,
features.
yeah, features
So
like
that, yeah, those are the features that are the pain in the ass to build,
yeah,
right? We were talking before about the 80/20, like the first 80% is easy and also you're motivated. But you mentioned instant management, like you surface an issue from data observability, like number of rows has dropped. It's the follow-up questions that are killer, right? Here, us in the data world, we know that the first question is not the hardest question, right? It's always the second and third and the fourth that once you get this alert and you ask, okay, well, what are the downstream dependencies? What are the upstream potential root causes? Building features like those take a substantial amount of time to build that integration, to pull in the lineage, and it's these sorts of features. I really like the way you put it. That when you buy a tool, you're effectively spreading the cost of additional features for for popular integrations with other customers,
yeah,
and that this kind of offsets the premium that you pay on the cloud hosting, right? In a sense, all SaaS tools are markup on top of AWS, right? Jeff Bezos always wins at the end of the day. Whereas for open source, you just pay for the raw metal costs. Same thing with building. So there's that bit of a trade-off there as well.
yeah, definitely. And like you said, the features. I think this is probably like one drawback of Bort is customization. But like you said before, SaaS vendors are going to try and meet the most popular uh, kind of integration points that their potential customers have. So obviously they're going to support Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, and the big data warehouses, the big BI tools, and ELT providers like Fivetran, Airflow, etc. But you know, will they have your very specific, custom data warehouse that you may have built? Because some people do that. No, in all honesty, no, they won't, and they won't want to, even if you ask. So that's one thing that's a drawback. But having said that, if you happen to have one of the permutations of the popular warehouses and tools, you get what feels like a very customized tool, actually. Like some of our customers are really pleased that we actually support their whole stack and it feels very customized to them.
It's quite surprising too with the consolidation in the space who we can support, right? A 30-person startup can have the same data stack as a 50,000-person company in many
Yeah,
ways, which is
yeah,
surprising. But on this topic, I want to be explicit that buying is the most financially expensive option, right? That in terms of like raw dollars leaving on an invoice, that like you are paying a markup. And the question is that markup worth it against the value that you get from a data observability tool and the cost that would have taken to implement something open source or to uh, build it yourself? And often the answer is yes. I would say almost across the board, the answer is yes, except when you're at Fang and you can build it yourself, or when there's like a zero expense policy, right? Like no money can go out the door, uh, which, you know, there's arguments either way of like, is this a good idea on principle? Whereas in reality, if you spend, for example, $10,000 to save your whole team this much time and help them move this much faster, was it worth it? Uh, it's it's hard to say, and the dynamics of kind of thinking through that trade-off and varies by organization to organization, right? It could even
yeah.
vary by exec to exec. It's hard to say.
Yeah, and I think that total costing is so key. It's like there's so much. Okay, yes, with SaaS or buying, you pay the vendor, but the whole point is that it's a reduction of other costs, like opportunity cost of what your people might be spending in whereas your people might end up working on this, building this functionality inside your company. They don't need to do that anymore. And with data observability, it's a double whammy of you'd have to do it yourself. Or if you didn't do it yourself, you end up with a load of issues that are harder to resolve and or come in without you knowing about it. And that has even higher costs. The likelihood of any data team saving real money from not buying this, I think it, I would bet against it. I'd bet my money against that, to be honest.
Which, I mean, leads to the question, what is best between build, buy, and open source? Like, can we make some blanket recommendations right now?
So I think if you're in a very constrained environment or you have very specialized needs, if you're like a big company and very specialized needs, then I think build is probably better than buy. Um, if you have that kind of budgetary constraint where you are not allowed to spend any money at all, and it doesn't matter if there's a higher opportunity cost or people cost from doing that, then you're kind of stuck with open source really, or building it. So, and if you're that constrained with budget, chances are building it's going to be difficult because you're not going to be able to hire extra people to help you do that. So I think in pretty much most other circumstances, buying makes sense. Um, just because of the value you get from buying what's actually kind of a sophisticated tool, which is difficult to build and difficult to build really, really well. Um, I think, yeah, in most circumstances, buying makes sense. And I think that's why, and I think we've seen this in the software observability market. Like you see New Relic, you see Datadog, you see Splunk. They're all like paid for tools, like SaaS offerings typically. And there's a reason. I think there will be a mirroring of that in the data observability market as well, and that being the most sensible approach.
Going off that analogy, though, there are some verticals that are a bit more, I think, amenable to open source. Some examples might be FinServe or healthcare environments where there's entire different types of companies that are specialized for those environments. Uh, so I think maybe open source deserves more consideration.
Yeah, I
Especially,
think it could, but also I think with those kind of like healthcare, for example, there's a whole software industry dedicated to healthcare actually, and it could just be not. It's not going to be SaaS. It's just going to be software that you can buy, like it's licensed software, like old pre-cloud world that you would then run on your own tin inside those companies, or you can use open source. But given their security requirements, I think it's more likely that they'd license this kind of software that's specialized for their industry. Yeah, I think that's a nice kind of move onto like Sanders' question, which was when you build it yourself, there are probably several hidden costs. One of them being maintenance costs. Yeah, and I think that's one of the big problems. Like, especially if you build it yourself and you're integrating with other providers' APIs. Like, imagine if you built your own data observability tool, but you're using like a Snowflake or a BigQuery, and then off-the-shelf BI tooling as well. Those APIs change, all the time. You then have to maintain your tool and keep adapting to those changes. And you have to look after the infrastructure it's on, making sure it's not run out of memory or disk, otherwise it fails. There's a lot. It's not, you know, exactly that kind of $10,000 like comment you made, Kevin. It's like if you think about that being like could you realistically run this for less than $10,000? Probably not, really, especially when you consider like the cost of that. You're going to have cloud hosting. You're going to have some SRE looking after it. It's just not going to be that cheap.
and there's so many other hidden currents in addition to the hidden costs, like you mentioned. The hidden maintenance costs, huge, right? But another thing I would mention is motivation, right? Building a new tool. I love building things. I think a lot of people in who are listening to this like creating things, but do you want to maintain it 6 months later? Like the emotional cost is quite high too. Especially when your docket is already overflowing with data work and you're getting a feature request or a bug report from an internal consumer. Yeah, it's difficult. That's what makes this conversation so interesting because there's so many like confluent currents, right? And one thing we didn't even talk about is the longevity of different. Uh, I would say the longevity of different offerings. Where if you're in it for the long haul, like perhaps an open source tool is going to be around longer than a pre-seed funded startup, or it could be the reverse, right? Like that startup might be around for 10 years, whereas this open source repository goes dormant. Building it yourself, maybe the people will leave. And that dramatically impacts the cost, especially if it's the switching cost down the line. But it's so difficult to tell. Of course, if we were able to uh, foresee the success of different companies, we wouldn't be here. We would be VCs, right? And it's difficult, but
that's really interesting. Like as a final thing, like with open source, where the open source projects like kind of fail as a project, and if you've become dependent on it, suddenly you're on the hook, right? That now becomes your project because you're dependent on it. So you end up maintaining it. So it's basically you're in a build situation. That's where you end up, except perhaps worse because you've got other random bits of code in there that you have no idea why it's in there.
wow, I would love to see like the state transition diagram. You mentioned before of like if you're using an open source tool, but they're gated on features and it's backed by a startup, which happens a lot, right?
Yeah.
Either a startup makes an open source tool or people make an open source tool and turn it into a startup. Because like you're going to buy anyways, eventually, in many
Yeah.
cases. But if you build it and you like piece of open source tool, you're going to open source, but then transition to right. It's like a transition. And I think a lot of the time people end up buying. And I'm not saying this, because we're obviously building a tool. This is just what we're saying uh, out there when talking to data leaders.
Yeah.
But that covers a lot of bases, I believe. We did write an article on this a couple of months ago that I'll post in the chat uh, after the call. But is there anything that we didn't cover, David?
No, I think that's it. I think we've covered all the questions that have come in as well. So yeah, I think we're good.
Yeah, this is a fascinating. We could probably have an even longer conversation about this, but we can have say that for another time. And thank you everyone for tuning in. If you have any questions or feedback, as always, let us know. We're constantly trying to improve. As you can see, our green screens and fake backgrounds are a little bit better, right? Better every time, right? And uh, yeah, next time we'll be here in 3D and in VR. So yeah,
Thanks,
see you
everyone.
all next week.
Bye.
Bye.